Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to my talk, 6 Simple Steps to SLOs. My name is Marie Cosgrove-Davies. I'm a product manager at Google Cloud, where I work on the Stackdriver suite, which encompasses logging, monitoring, application performance monitoring tools, and incident response management tools. And in a previous life, I was a product manager at Pivotal, which is why I'm here today. And before that, I did all sorts of things, including site reliability engineering, product management elsewhere, implementation engineering, and technical support. So I have a varied background. Now, I'm going to start this talk by making a really big assumption about everyone in this room, including myself, and that's that we all have systems that we care about. And what we care about is that we want to know our systems are working. We want to know our users can do what they need to. And we also want to make sure that our teams don't get alert fatigue, that we're not getting paged too much at 3 a.m. So this is the topic of my talk. 6 simple steps to SLOs. We'll start with the basics. We'll build on that. And at the end, you will have a comprehensive solution in 20 minutes of how to solve all these problems. All right. So I mentioned earlier that I'm a product manager, and step 1 is think like a PM. Now, if I were a user experience researcher, I would tell you to be thinking like a UXR, but I want you to be like me. And what I mean by that is a lot of my job is thinking about the users of my products. What are they doing? How are they interacting with my products? What do they need to accomplish? It doesn't really matter if these users are humans or computers, by the way. They're both equally valid. And what this means is I'm asking myself a lot of questions that boil down to 3 things. What does working mean for my service, for my users? How can I measure it? And how can I know if something's not working, if my service is not functioning? These are the 3 basic questions that I ask myself. So step 2 is to identify your users. This seems really basic, but it's actually easy to forget. It's easy to make assumptions about who you think your users are. Don't do that. Pause, give it some thought. We're going to go through an example here, which is a very silly example. I have some cats. My cats are adorable. And we're going to pretend that I have a website where people can go to see pictures of my adorable cats. So my users, in this case, are people just like you who think my cats are really cute and want to go to my website. That's one type of user. I might have another type of user, which could be someone like me who needs to upload cat pictures to the website. And in a more complex service, you would have a bunch of different categories of users, whether they're developers or operators or database admins. And you would think about all of these user groups separately. Once you've figured out what the types of users are for your service, you need to think about their user journeys. How are they interacting with their service? What does success look like for them? And so what I like to do is for each user, I'll make a list of all of the ways that they interact with my service, whether it seems big or it seems trivial. And this lets me really think through what they're doing, what their goals are, and what their experience is. So, in my example user journey, you might go to this website to see a picture of my cat. She's very cute. For every type of user, you'll probably have a set of user journeys. And once you've got that list, you'll go through the list and identify a few, usually it's like 2 to 5, that are really important. And often it's pretty clear what the core value proposition for your service is. What are those critical user journeys? What do you want to make sure that you deliver to your users? And so those 2 to 5 things, those core user journeys, are what we're going to be focusing on from here on out. All right, now we have a vocabulary break because I want to make sure that everyone knows these acronyms that I'm about to start using. Probably most of you do, but let's get on the same page. A service level indicator is a metric that indicates whether or not a user is having success with a specific workflow they're trying to do with your product, a specific user journey. A service level objective is a threshold that you apply to an indicator metric that defines when you think users are happy and when you think they're sad. So it's that threshold between happy and sad. And a service level agreement, which is not covered at all by this talk, but which I'm adding here to disambiguate, is a contractual agreement between usually two companies that a certain level of service will be provided, or there are some sort of penalties, typically financial ones. Again, we're not talking about SLAs at all, but I mention it because people often mix SLAs up with SLIs and SLOs. SLIs and SLOs have no penalties associated. They're typically internal measurements. You usually don't tell your users about them. All right, so we're back to the steps. Step 4 is to track your user journeys. We've figured out what's the most important. What do our users really need to do with our service? How do we track that? And again, what I like to do is to sort of take a break. It's really tempting to say, okay, we're gonna go write code right now. We've got our user journeys, we know exactly what's gonna happen. But I like to write out really defined English summaries of what each of these service level indicators, SLIs, that represents our user journeys will be. And this will include things like how we will measure each of these SLIs. And so in my example, I want to measure the latency of cat photos loading on the site. And I've decided to measure it using instrumentation that I will embed on my site. So I'm gonna put some kind of JavaScript applet or something on my site so that I can get pretty close to the user experience. Now, this has a lot of assumptions built into it, and it has some pros and cons. This is the right time to talk to your product team, talk to your engineering team, figure out whether this is the right thing to do. Maybe we would decide, gosh, I don't know, it's not that important to get that close to the user experience. We could probably measure it from the back end and get a good proxy for what it would be, and then we wouldn't have to instrument our front end and add this additional step, this additional maintenance burden, additional code. There will always be pluses and minuses to a type of SLI measurement, and what's important is to consider what they are and to make a clear decision about what you're accepting. So my example SLI in English, and we are measuring the latency that it takes to load a cat picture. Now, if we were measuring the latency between when I loaded this slide and when the picture came up, I don't think we would be doing very well. As a side note, when we're measuring SLIs, there are a couple approaches we can take. One is to measure the number of good minutes and divide it by the number of total minutes and to say, okay, that's the good time. This has a couple advantages. It's really easy for us as humans to understand. Like, I totally understand what like good minutes over total minutes means. And it works well for systems that are either always up or always down. Where we really run into challenges, though, is with distributed request response systems. So if I have a service with 3 servers and one of them is down, is it a good minute? Is it a bad minute? I don't know, it's kind of hard to say. That's where this model breaks down. So what I like to do instead is to look at good interactions divided by total interactions. And this solves the problem of the distributed request response system. If an interaction succeeds, it's a good interaction. If it fails, it's a bad interaction. So in that example where one of our 3 servers is down, if it's not fielding any requests, we're 100% up. If it's fielding all the requests, we're 100% down. And if it's fielding a third, then we're 66% up. It's a very clear breakdown. One additional benefit of this way of measurement is that it's really user-focused. There are a lot of services where traffic might not be balanced across all the minutes evenly. Think of like any consumer website ever. And so it's a little silly to say that a minute from 2 a.m. to 2:01 a.m. is the same as a minute from noon to 12:05, or 12:01 rather. And this good requests versus total requests allows you to really focus on the user experience and make sure that you are providing it when it's needed. Okay, back to our steps. Now we get to the title of the talk. We're going to pick our service level objectives. And luckily, you're all fans of Agile here, being friends of Pivotal. So this advice that I'm going to give you is going to work pretty well. And that is just like pick a number and try it and see how it goes, and then iterate from there. It's really, really tempting to pick the perfect number up front. and to say, oh, well, we have to think really hard about this. It's very important. We want to make sure it's right. We're not asking you to get this tattooed on your arm. We're not going to carve it in stone above your door. You can change it anytime. What's most important is getting started, measuring it, seeing how it goes, seeing how your users respond, and then going from there. One caveat that I'll add here is that if you pick a really high number to start with, your users are unlikely to call you and say, this system is too responsive, it's too available, I don't like it. So my advice, and what I'm doing with my cat photo site here, is to pick a pretty low number to start with. People will definitely tell you if your thing is not working as well as they expect. So in this example, I expect 90% of page views to load in under 1 second. That's a really low SLO. I would kind of expect all of you to call me, to text me, to email me and say, Marie, where are the cat pictures? They're not there. I need a higher SLO. And then I would be able to get that feedback and raise my SLO because I know my users need more. Now, one note, there is a temptation, especially among enterprises, to say, but wait, my app is really important. My service can't ever be down. If you say that, then this whole process is useless because nothing, even 911, internet, your cell phone, is 100% available. This whole process is predicated on the idea that 100% is the wrong target, that it actually is counterproductive to aim for it because you'll always miss. So, how do we think about this? When we're defining our SLOs, we normally talk about a number of nines. I defined a 1-9 SLO at 90%. You could have a 2 nines SLO, 99%, 3 nines, 99.9, and so on. I don't know about you all, but if I think about the difference between 99% and 99.9%, I kind of think, well, I don't know, in high school I would have been happy with either of those test scores. It's kind of hard as a human to conceptualize that difference. So there's a tool that's called error budgets, which is the amount of wiggle room you have before you're below your SLO. That's 100% minus whatever SLO you choose. And error budgets help make, for me, the idea of SLOs really concrete. So if we're looking at this table, which is, I know, hard to read, so sorry about that, the difference between my 90% SLO that I've chosen and a 2 nines SLO or a 3 nines SLO is so clear when I'm talking about the amount of time I'm allowed to be down rather than the amount of time I'm expected to be up. One note, I probably won't have my cat photo site down for 36 days, like an entire month and then up for the rest of the year. It's likely, as with most services, that your downtime will be distributed throughout the period that you're measuring. So don't necessarily think of this as like, well, can my users be without my site for 9 days? Think of it as, can we take 9 days of downtime over a quarter? Okay, now we're at the last step, and I had to break this into 2 pieces because it didn't fit on the slide. The last step is to update your operational practices. We talked at the beginning about how what we wanted to make sure of was that we understood when our service was working, that we knew what our users wanted, and that we weren't getting alert fatigue. And this is like the way that we take everything we've built with our SLIs and SLOs and feed it back in to accomplish those goals. So the first thing is to update your monitoring. With your SLI, you now have a metric that you know represents your user's happiness. You know that that's something that you can alert on to figure out if your user is sad. So why are you still paging on like CPU utilization? If your CPU is pegged at 100%, but your user journeys are still happening, your users are still able to do what they need to do with your service, then don't wake yourself up at 3 a.m. It's not worth it. You can fix it tomorrow. This is really the most important thing. And I know it can be scary to think, well, I have this monitoring. I've built it up over years. I'm not just going to throw it away. That seems like such a waste. My recommendation, if you feel uncomfortable switching over to SLI-based alerting, is to run it in parallel with your existing monitoring for a week, for a couple weeks, for a month, and then take a look at it. See, did my SLI-based alerting catch the actual downtime? Did it have any false positives? Did my existing alerting catch the downtime, and did that have false positives? And if you've done your SLIs right, if you've written them so they make sense and so they represent your user value, I think you'll be convinced. If not, you can go back to the drawing board, formulate new SLIs. Because that's really what you want to be moving towards, is where your SLIs will tell you when the users are sad. And it's a little hard to see the slides here for me, but my example is I might change my alerting to fire when I've consumed a certain percentage of my error budget within an hour. So instead of, I don't know, VMs, their utilization's creeping up, I would just look at that error budget usage and page on that. All right, the second part of the operational shift, slide 2, is how you behave when you're below your SLO. We all live in the real world. Sometimes things happen. Sometimes things break. That's okay. This is a system that's designed for the real world. And part of how it's designed is that when you are below your SLO, you know your users are sad. You know you don't want your users to be sad, then they won't keep using your service. So you need to change your behavior to make your users happier until you're above your SLO. And there are a couple ways that you might change your behavior. A big one is to reduce your non-reliability releases. Now, Google SREs have identified that a very large percentage of production issues come from new releases. So the more releases you do, the more likely you are to encounter issues. If you're below your SLO, you don't want to encounter issues, so reduce your releases. Another thing you can do is to focus on reliability features. These features are really critical to make sure that your customers can enjoy all of the rest of your features, because if your site's not reliable enough, they won't bother to see how cool everything else is. And the last thing that you can do is to pay down your tech debt. So in my example, I'm below my SLO on my cat picture site. Maybe it's finally time to scale it up from 1 instance to 2. All right, to recap, these are my 6 steps. You are all able to read, so I will not read them out to you. This slide deck will also be available afterwards, so you can come back to it. Now, do you want to do this easily? It sounds cool, right? But wouldn't it be great if there were a tool that would help you do it? If you use Google Cloud, I have some great news, which is we have an early access program as part of Stackdriver monitoring that helps you define and track SLOs in a really straightforward way. It supports latency and availability SLOs. In this example, I'm defining a latency SLO of 100 milliseconds, or SLI, sorry. And then you choose your period, which is either a week or a month, and you choose your goal, aka SLO. One note on this is that roughly, for every additional 9 you add to your SLO, your cost increases by 10x. So something to think about, again, as you're defining your SLO, how much are you willing to spend for your reliability? How important is it to your business? And one note I have here is that you can get 3 nines broadly from well-engineered software, such as PCF. You can get 4 nines from a well-engineered operations team. And for 5 nines, you need a well-engineered business. Everyone has to work together. That's a lot of effort. So you need to make sure it's important for your users. All right, and then in the workflow, we click through, we confirm, and we start measuring. This is an example graph. I am not doing well on my SLO in the last hour, so I probably need to look into this. Okay, I think I zipped through my material, so I will have some time for questions, but I wanted to make sure there were some links to additional resources here. There are 2 SRE books that have been put out by Google and partners. The first one, the original Site Reliability Engineering book, is available for free online, google.com/SRE. The second one just came out this summer. It's called the Site Reliability Workbook. This is actually my favorite because it includes a lot of information from people who aren't Google about how they did site reliability, and I think that's a little more valuable to anyone who's not operating at like a mind-boggling scale. There are also a series of really good blog posts from the Customer Reliability Engineering team at Google. These are folks who go out to our biggest cloud customers and work with them to implement SRE practices. So they have a ton of field experience. Really good blog posts. There's a link, which you'll be able to click when you download the presentation later. And lastly, Pivotal's Cloud Ops team just wrote a blog post recently on their experience adopting SRE practices, and I highly recommend you check that out as well. That's it. Please rate me in the app. I would love feedback on my talk, and I can take a couple questions.
So you talked about defining SLOs in a conversation that happens with product engineering before coding when they start.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me more about that conversation and what's brought the conversation, what things you should be thinking about and talking about at that point in time?
That's a really good question. So one useful tool that I've been discussing internally with folks is the idea of sort of a curve that defines the utility of an SLI. So if you know that there's a cliff at 1 second where, for instance, Google search has a cliff at some point where if you return results too late, then it doesn't matter because we've already sent things to the user, right? So if you know that, then you can say, all right, anything after this threshold is useless. We know it has to be under this threshold. You could also say, my users have a lot of utility if the site goes fast up to this point, but sort of marginal increasing utility if it goes fast after that point because it seems fast enough. And there are a lot of user experience studies about what humans think of as fast and what responses they expect. And that can help inform the discussions as well. Does that help? So when you're putting them together? It's a great question. One way that I approach it is to think about an end-to-end SLO for the full user experience, and then to define SLOs for each service, thinking of the users as the downstream services. You can also, depending on how cozy you are with your upstream services, sort of measure their SLOs as well, define what you think they need to provide to you, and start tracking that and see if they're delivering.
You have a section on what to do if you're underperforming.
Mm-hmm.
You've got any advice if you're doing really, really well?
That is interesting. So the Google SRE book would say, if you think your SLO is correct and you're overperforming, then take some downtime, because you are acclimating your users to a higher level of service than you actually believe you need to. It's true. There are services at Google where they take intentional downtime to make sure that everything downstream can deal with it. If you think that maybe your users kind of expect that level of reliability, then you can raise your SLO. Exactly. Yeah, so you could use some kind of chaos monkey or chaos engineering to cause some problems with your service and some downstream issues.
So if you have multiple SLIs and say for errors and latency, do you typically relate to those as separate SLOs as well, or do you kind of roll it up into a single SLO and satisfy requests?
So the question is around if you have multiple SLIs that represent different things, do you usually roll them up or track them separately? I usually track them separately because the way that I would respond to an issue where the error rate increased is pretty different from how I would respond to an increase in latency. One note is that you may define multiple SLOs for the same SLI. So you might have a 50th% latency SLO and a 99th% latency SLO, and then a 99.9th percentile latency SLO. And you could have different expectations for those. Any other questions?
So if I have a full workflow, and what level of granularity do you usually go to for your end user? Is it the full workflow of that user? Say you're able to accomplish their task, or do you get more granular where you're looking at individual transactions, specific response times that can contribute to that workflow?
Okay, so the question is, if you have a full workflow, do you want to measure the whole thing? Do you want to measure little chunks? I would say it depends in part on how much of it your team owns. Ultimately, if the user needs to do all of the transactions in order to come out at the end being happy, you probably want to be measuring that. But if that requirement spans multiple teams, then you may want to be measuring individual chunks as well to make sure that your team is able to deliver on the expectations that the workflow puts on them.
And then when you, with each transaction, transaction, would you define, go through that process of defining the response time first? Would it be the actual response time from the service, or would it be the actual time that you look at from the page and the time the user went to that page?
This is part of the discussion that you have to have, is whether you want to get as close to the user as you can. Like, even in my example, if the user's ISP was slow, there would be a lot of latency I wasn't tracking. So you sort of lose user representation as you start moving your measurement closer to your backend systems. But you may believe that that's a sufficient proxy for what you're trying to measure. Mhm. So what is a well-engineered business? It's a business where the people making the financial decisions are willing to invest whatever it takes, essentially, to get that level of reliability, and where they're willing to stop feature releases, stop delivering additional non-reliability features to users as needed. I don't know what your business is like, but I've been in businesses that were sales-driven, where regardless of the reliability, like, you had to get the next feature out. And there's a lot more on that in the SRE book as well.
What do you think is a strategy for workflows that have different drop-off points? Do you take a happy path typically, or are you like, so I'm a user and there might be different with permutations of the flow that capture different transactions? What's typically your strategy for trying to cover as much as possible, ensure that those different flows are captured?
So for branching workflows, how do you measure them? Is that kind of the question?
Yeah. What's your strategy for trying to get as much coverage so that you're keeping your customer base happy without going crazy with too much permutation?
I haven't thought extensively about this, so this is my off-the-cuff answer, but I would think about what my core user journeys are. So, like, this is the most important thing for a user to do with my product. Like, Snapchat, it's probably like taking a picture. Like, adding emoji to the picture might be a secondary journey, or I don't use Snapchat, but whatever you do with Snapchat. But that might not be something where I would have an SLI set up, because if the emoji aren't working, you can still take the picture, which is the core functionality. All right, I think we're about out of time, but I will be around. Please come chat with me. I would love to talk more about this. Thanks.